Good afternoon. My name is Mary Lewis. I'm a historian of France and its former empire, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the Minda de Gunsberg Center for European Studies and to the Stanley Hoffman Annual Lecture on France and the World. This series honors the legacy of Stanley Hoffman, one of the founders of the Center for European Studies in 1969, and where he served as its director from that time until 1995. Stanley was born in Vienna and spent his early childhood outside of Paris, from where he was forced to flee south with his mother in 1940. The experience of the Second World War and the Holocaust profoundly affected him and was one motivation, among others, of his lifelong study of international politics. His scholarly work ranged widely from French domestic politics to American foreign policy to international relations. A rare breed in American political science, he was more comfortable reflecting on philosophy and literature than on electoral results, the latter never number crunched, but always considered in relation to a broader political culture. As a teacher, a scholar, and public intellectual, Hoffman embodied the liberal arts ethos. His contribution to the founding of the social studies concentration at Harvard is but one example of this. His role in establishing the CES is another. And at a university abounding with hierarchies, Stanley eschewed them. He only cared about the quality of the mind of the person he was interacting with, whether they were a senior scholar, a junior faculty person, or a first-year undergrad, and he loved teaching undergrads. I have the honor of using the office he once called his, and I try to embody the ethos of his curiosity and intellectual engagement. Caroline Ford also embodies that curiosity and intellectual engagement. The arc of her career is extraordinary. She began her career lecturing at the University of Chicago before serving here as an assistant and associate professor of history between 1988 and 1995, during which time I'm sure you got to know Stanley. And then she moved to the University of British Columbia and then UCLA, where she currently holds the Peter Ryle Chair in European History. I have been a big admirer of Caroline's work ever since reading in graduate school her groundbreaking work, Creating the Nation in Provincial France, Religion and Political Identity in Brittany, which was published in 1993, the year I started graduate school, and which challenged the idea that nation building in 19th and 20th century France was a story of republicanism accompanied by secularization. Ford showed instead how in Catholic Brittany, a kind of proto-Christian democratic movement emerged, demonstrating how Catholics used modern politics and organizing principles to resist the closure, for example, of convent-run schools. This book made a big impression on me as I was learning this profession, and I think it influenced the approach I took in my first book, which also, from a different angle, challenged assumptions about French republicanism. But even more remarkable is where she went from there. She published Divided Houses, a book on religion and gender in modern France, in 2005, and then she began examining the environmental history of France and its colonies, which she explored in a number of important articles and in a book entitled Natural Interests, The Contest Over Environment in Modern France, which was published in 2016 and which was translated remarkably quickly 2 years later, that is really fast, into French as Naissance de l'écologie. I find Caroline's scholarly trajectory and the way she continually gets interested in new things inspiring. She is currently working on 2 different books, one called The European Housing Crisis and the Origins of Modernism in Domestic Architecture, 1894 to 1940, and the other, An Environmental History of Paris, which will be published with Oxford University Press. And it is this latter book that she will speak to us about today in a talk entitled The Shape of Water, An Environmental History of the City of Light. Please join me in welcoming Caroline Ford.
Okay, I want to begin by saying that I was delighted to receive the invitation to deliver the Stanley Hoffman Lecture on France and the World this year. And I was particularly honored because I knew Stanley Hoffman as a colleague and I admired him when I was first starting my career as an assistant and associate professor here at Harvard. So it's wonderful for me to pay homage to him and to his intellectual curiosity, which is something that has stayed with me ever since. And I also want to thank the director and executive director of the center, Mary Lewis, my colleague and friend, and the staff, Susanna and Anna and Michael, who've made the arrangements for me so seamlessly. So thank you all. My lecture today is part of a book that Mary referenced on the environmental history of Paris, which explores the city's environment in all of its interconnected facets at a moment when it transitioned from being a pre-modern to a modern city, roughly from the 18th to the 20th centuries. Its chapters are organized around the elements of earth, air, fire, and water, and they center on how the city's environment evolved in time and space. In addition to the perspectives and methodologies of environmental history, the book employs other interdisciplinary conceptual frameworks. And I just wanted to mention a few here, 4 of them. Long-established social theorists such as Henri Lefebvre, sensory historians, urban planners, geographers, Matthew Gandhi has been particularly important to me, and landscape architects such as Dilip da Cunha. As the title of my talk suggests, my focus today is on water and the hydrological history of Paris. And I want to emphasize that Henri Lefebvre's work has been particularly important to me in thinking about urban environmental space and the space in particular that water occupies. Henri Lefebvre argues that all human space is socially produced, and he regarded space as a tripartite phenomenon. I'll give you a little picture here. In which space is produced by different social actors and comprised of perceived space, le perçu, conceived space, le conçu, and lived space, le vécu. Perceived space refers to subjective perceptions of the physical environment in all of its forms, auditory, tactile, visual, and olfactory, while conceived space is constituted from abstract ideas that, for example, states and engineers use to change the physical environment, whereas lived space, for Lefebvre, is, quote, directly lived through associated images and symbols. Lefebvre also understood the production of space is by definition a historical process. Quote, every social space has a history, one invariably grounded in nature, in natural conditions that are at once primordial and unique. However, the idea of nature presents a particular set of problems for Lefebvre and for the historian of urban spaces, because by the 20th century, if not before, the boundary between what was natural and what was human-made is very porous. The city of Paris has a long aqueous past. It occupied what was once a vast inland sea, and when that sea receded, it left behind 2 main rivers, as well as islands on whose marshy banks the Parisi tribe, after which the city is named, established its first settlement. The sources of the city's water were, of course, many, ranging from its principal river, the Seine, and her less favored cousin, the Bièvre, as well as ponds, rivulets, springs, and once plentiful reserves of groundwater. At the center of this hydrological history are the city's rivers, however. Paris was built on a river and depended on water, but the nature of the city's needs, and we must be conscious and very cautious of how needs were defined and have been redefined historically. Its relationship with its two rivers changed dramatically over time. It was in the 19th century, as I argue today, that the city's waterscape and its urban metabolism, a term richly developed by the urban planner Sabine Ball, changed, which had far-reaching consequences in terms of how water was used, abused, and distributed to the city's inhabitants. That transformation was largely achieved through human engineering as a way of conceiving urban space in new ways, which resulted in a hybrid hydrological city. This fundamentally changed the spaces where water was visible above ground and where it came to be buried, channeled into man-made cavities. Isabelle Bacouche, the historian, argues that in the 19th century, the River Seine, the cradle of the capital, entirely lost its vitality, its place of centrality in the minds of Parisians. I argue that the opposite is in fact true, and that Parisians and all manner of visitors instead engaged with the river and with the city's waterscape in fundamentally new ways. In the process, the Seine, it is true, shifted from being the principal carrier of certain kinds of urban flow from a site of navigation and transport to providing for the city's needs in terms of sanitation, cleaning, and potable water, which then led to new kinds of waterscapes, and then moving on to being valorized in aesthetic terms. What I want to trace today is these changing hydrological systems and the role of the Seine in particular, from its primary use for navigation to water as sanitation and individual consumption, and then to waterscapes for aesthetic purposes. And this is kind of an outline of what I want to be talking about today. And I want to stress at the end that this all resulted in the city's second river, the Bièvre, becoming Paris's hydrological environmental casualty, its kind of aquatic sacrifice. There was, in the words of Simon Lacordaire, always a, quote, magical link between the Seine and Paris. The Seine measures 482 miles long, and its source can be located at the foot of a limestone hill on the Langres Plateau, formerly in the province of Brittany. It empties into the English Channel at Le Havre, and initially it was much broader and shallower, and the Seine has become narrower and deeper over time, while dividing Paris into two parts, the right and the left banks, with a growing number of bridges connecting them. And these are sort of two maps from the 18th and the 19th century, and I'm going to return to this one quite a lot, which is Turgot's map, which is kind of a promotional map almost. And this is a 19th century aerial map. I'm sorry about the resolution. Water was the most important of all urban flows in and out of the city, and the Seine's central importance early on lay in its role in supplying it with its energy in the form of wood that was bundled and floated into it in the form of foodstuffs as well. The Marquis de Vauban wrote in 1698, quote, "It is still one of the wet nurses of Paris, as it brings all the wine from Burgundy, the floating wood from the Morvan, and much wheat and oats besides." The city of Paris exercised considerable control over its rivers and tributaries, even though the 1669 Water and Forest Administration gave the state outside influence. The Seine itself was dotted with an archipelago of islands. Many of these islands have long since disappeared, and others have changed in shape over the centuries. In the years before dredging and embankment, many came and went naturally. There are now only two natural islands in central Paris, the Ile de la Cité and the Ile Saint-Louis. One man-made island, the Ile aux Cygnes, or the Island of the Swans, and the rest are hybrid creations. Their existence and function were shaped by the changing role of the river as the source of urban flows of food and energy in pre-modern Paris. In the 18th century, for example, the Ile Louviers, next to the Ile Saint-Louis, had an outsized importance. It's no longer there, you can't see it anymore. It was acquired by the city of Paris in 1700, and plots were rented out to wood merchants to store oversized pieces of wood and construction material. And there are hundreds of these prints actually in the Musée Carnavalet. Islands and water provided protection, as the history of the Seine's oldest inhabited island, the Ile de la Cité, suggests. They were also used for grazing pastures, places to wash clothes and fish. Among the earlier islands, which have long since vanished from upstream to downstream, were the Île aux Vaches and the Île Notre Dame. And there we are again. This is from Turgot's, kind of blown up from Turgot's map. While some islands vanished, others were joined to one or the other of the banks of the Seine, and that's what happened to the Île Louviers. It's now part of the right bank, for those of you who know Paris, around the Arsenal. Energy transformation, the move toward fossil fuels, population growth, and political as well as economic changes profoundly transformed the role of the Seine and how it was used. It ceased to be looked to primarily for the needs of navigation. The revolution also diminished the city's control of water flows and access to rivers outside its boundaries, and gave more of it to the state. The city increasingly began to consider the waters of the Seine differently. In the word of Sabine Barle, it began, quote, looking to the river as a source of water for sanitation. In a major and fundamental shift, focus on the river and on water more generally moved from transport to water supply for cleaning of urban space, for hygiene, and for increased amounts of drinking water. One of the problems, however, with the settlement of Paris from the start was that the Seine was a relatively small river in a restricted river basin, and it often froze over in the winter and was sometimes reduced to a stream in the summer. The city often had to look for other sources of water, relying on aqueducts, wells. These are all the kind of sources of water in the city, rainwater tanks and pipes carrying water from the Seine and from springs, and increasingly on the ubiquitous porteurs d'eau, or the water carriers, who carried water from where they could and suddenly appeared on the urban historical landscape in huge numbers in the 17th century. In short, from Paris's earliest settlement, water from the Seine and the Bièvre rivers was never enough to meet the needs of its inhabitants, and those needs only gradually began to be defined as such by engineers, city elders, and the state. No one really knew also how much the city consumed or for what. And there was a whole debate, particularly among engineers, about what a water need was and for whom it was needed, which really crystallized in the 18th century. And this is extremely important, in fact. By no means is it a simple question. And no one had really begun to articulate it in these terms until the 18th century. In order to get at the environmental history of water, in fact, and water in Paris, we need also a kind of intellectual history of water, how it was thought about as a resource and as a need. And I cite a fascinating and very neglected work, in my opinion, on this subject by Frédéric Grabert, which I'll return to, called Inventing Needs, Expertise and Water Supply in 18th and early 19th century Paris. The left bank was always more deprived of water than the right bank. Clean sources of water were scarce, and a reliable supply for a growing population increasingly required ingenuity and eventually technological prowess. As early as the 2nd century AD, of course, we know the Romans had brought water from the southern plateau of Rungis by building an aqueduct, the Alcoy Aqueduct. The first initiatives undertaken by the city's residents, however, to procure drinking water for themselves from a source other than the Seine was to dig deep wells. And the ground beneath Paris had an abundant supply of water at both superficial and deeper levels. Paris exploited both, and the mineral spring water from Passy, which was discovered in the 16th century and later imbibed and commented on by Helvetius, Condorcet, and Benjamin Franklin in the 18th century, was particularly prized. It is impossible to know the precise number of wells that existed across the centuries, but the first census of them was undertaken in 1870 by the Paris Water Service, which documented 30,000 of them. Despite the fact that public wells were maintained by the city, they had long ago become contaminated because many of them were relatively shallow. However, it was not until the second half of the 19th century that the water for many was declared unfit for human consumption. And they had in part been a source of epidemics, really, from that afflicted Paris from the Middle Ages to cholera in the 19th century. Virtually all of them were abandoned by the early 20th century, which brings us to the city's fountains. The city's fountains appeared relatively late, one of the earliest being the Fontaine des Innocents of 1550, which originally served religious communities. Initially, all of the fountains were on the right bank. By 1669, the city had 35 of them. 15 of them supplied with the water from Rungis, that's to say from in the south, 9 from Belleville, and 11 from the Pré Saint-Gervais. In the 15th and 16th centuries, Paris experienced periodic severe droughts. Water distribution was neglected and fountains no longer functioned for obvious reasons during the wars of religion. And when Henry IV came to power in 1589, he identified water provisioning as the most pressing problem facing the capital. And he instructed François Mirand, the city's provost of merchants, to repair its fountains. But he left his greatest mark on the city in terms of hydraulic power by inaugurating an era of elevated machines, as they were called, to pump water out of the Seine. The city's first hydraulic pump, the Samaritaine, it's not a department store, a wheel-operated system pumping water to public fountains on the right bank, was constructed at Pont-Neuf between 1605 and 1608. And then again, we have Turgot's map there, his promotional map. In the midst of another drought, a second pump was constructed. This is a very elegant construction and building architecturally. In the midst of another drought in the 1670s, another one was constructed at the Pont Notre Dame. And we have that one, which is far less elegant, I think, in the way it is presented. And they remained in use and were visible landmarks on the city's waterscape until 1813 and 1853, respectively, when they were removed. At the end of the 18th century, water consumption per capita was very low by present-day standards. But we don't really know. These are all approximations. It was estimated at between 10 to 12 liters a day per person, which was used for everything, drinking water, cooking, animals, cleaning. To give a sense of present-day contrasts, in the late 20th century, inhabitants of Western European cities consumed approximately 144 liters per person per day. Consumption in the US was different, much higher at 350 liters per day. If the water supply for the city's general population in the early modern period came from its two rivers, wells, fountains, water carriers became increasingly important in the social and environmental space of Paris, particularly for those living farther and farther from the river banks. Indeed, legions of water carriers, for some reason, I don't know why, but they tended to come from the Auvergne, and they're frequently referred to as the Auvergnats, to provide much of the water consumed by Parisians for domestic use. The water carriers were of two kinds: those on foot, who carried two buckets of water of about 15 liters each, and who took their water from the fountains and from the river, and those who transported enormous barrels of river water throughout the city, either carrying them or sometimes they're horse-drawn. These are two images from the Musée Carnavalet. Louis-Sébastien Mercier, author of Le Tableau de Paris, which is kind of a picture of Paris in all its forms at the end of the 18th century, estimated that by the eve of the French Revolution, there are about 20,000 of these water carriers. What about the water itself? The Roman Emperor Julian wrote in 358 that the water of the Seine was, quote, very pure and attractive to the eye. However, by the 17th century, its quality had clearly deteriorated, or at least perceptions thereof. And it had a particularly bad reputation among foreign visitors, and particularly the English. In 1698, an English physician, Martin Lister, spent time in Paris and wrote in his journal that he had been warned about the river's poor quality and that dysentery was one of the city's most common maladies. Close to a century later, Mercier characterized the Seine as, quote, a large and black as the Styx, thick and silty. While acknowledging its slightly purgative effects, he nonetheless humorously added, quote, that it is proverbially said that it comes out of the thigh of an angel. The quality of the Seine's water had long been judged by its taste, smell, and color. A Jesuit priest wrote in 1665 that, quote, there are those who taste and distinguish between different waters as they do with wine. By the 18th century, olfaction played an essential role in determining the quality of water, and water that was derived from rivers and streams was considered to be superior from that of wells and tanks. In spite of the differing views on the Seine as a source of drinking water, it was clear to many that its quality had changed considerably. A physician and pioneer in the field of public hygiene, Jean-Noël Allais, undertook a study of its quality in 1790. And its contamination was evident with the disappearance of a lot of its aquatic life. Increasing concern about the lack of water in Paris in the 18th century for domestic consumption prompted the city and monarchy to conceive of new water infrastructure projects, both public and private, that focused on the pumping of the Seine using new technologies and diverting and creating canals from distant rivers. One project was offered by the Perrier brothers and involved installing 2 British pump engines in the 1770s and 1780s, but the company failed due to financial problems and resistance by an apparent army of water carriers, which was an object lesson concerning the ways in which conceived and lived environmental space, as Henri Lefebvre's terminology could come into conflict. While one normally associates the shift to concerns about water as a resource, as a need for consumption and sanitation on the part of the entire urban population to the period of Haussmannization, during which the modern infrastructure of Paris is widely viewed as having been born, I argue that the shift occurred much earlier, and many new initiatives were already apparent in the late 18th century, and especially in the Napoleonic period at the beginning of the 19th century. This period was in many ways, in my view, more pivotal in giving birth to new ways of thinking which preceded this, about water as a resource, about water needs, giving rise to new perceptions about the role of water in the urban spaces and what that role should be, asking the question of what the role of water should be. One normally does not think about the Napoleonic episode in these terms, but the French state undertook some of the boldest urban initiatives in terms of supplying Paris with water and for new purposes. Indeed, Napoleon Bonaparte's water initiatives and the work of his chief water engineer, Pierre-Simon Girard, who was actually in his 30s, in many ways paved the way for the work of Haussmann and his chief engineer, Eugène Belgrand. In his memoir, Jean-Antoine Chaptal, Napoleon's Minister of Internal Affairs, recounted a conversation he had had with Napoleon soon after he came to power, in which Napoleon allegedly said, "I want to do something great and useful for Paris. What are your ideas?" And they talked about the fact that there was no genuinely free public water fountain. There were public fountains, widely available watering troughs or means of cleaning streets in an effective way. And they discussed the installation of new water pumps and diverting the Ourcq River for these purposes. It is with this exchange between Chaptal and Napoleon that I seem to have touch some of these keys here. That the project for the Ourcq Canal was born, but not before Napoleon conceived of another plan. In 1802, he wrote this time to Nicolas Frochot, the first holder of the office of the prefect of the Seine, and that therefore Haussmann's predecessor, that he was concerned that Paris did not have and should have abundant flowing water, eau jaillissante. Bear in mind that Napoleon had just come back from a series of battles, and the ink on the Treaty of Amiens, signed in 1802, was barely dry. There were approximately 65 fountains in Paris at the beginning of the 18th century, and some say they increased to 100 by century's end, which provided water for a charge and which only ran certain hours of the day and was turned off at night. An imperial decree issued on the 2nd of May, 1806, stipulated that beginning on July 1 of that year, water from the city's fountains would be available to all inhabitants day and night, and that this should be facilitated through the city's public services in order to, quote, refresh the atmosphere and clean the city streets. In addition, Napoleon proposed establishing 15 new fountains, 7 on the right bank and 8 on the left bank, to provide new sources of water for the general population of Paris. Of course, he wanted the fountains to commemorate his own military achievements. 3 of the most admired at the time survive to this day, including the Fontaine du Fellah, which shelters a full-size statue of a laborer in Neo-Egyptian garb to commemorate Napoleon's Egyptian campaign. For those of you who know Paris, it's right down the street from the Bon Marché, and it no longer works. This was followed by the Fontaine du Palmier in the Place du Châtelet, and this again by the Fontaine de Mars, all constructed around the same time, which was adorned with bas-reliefs of Mars, the god of war, but more tellingly, in terms of our hydrological Parisian story, Hygeia, the Greek goddess of health, cleanliness, and sanitation. Then there was the ill-fated Fontaine de l'Éléphant, a plaster model fountain which occupied the Place de la Bastille, and the water actually did come out of the trunk. The Place de la Bastille from 1813 to 1846. And it was supposed to no longer be plaster, but then to be replaced with some kind of metallic thing, but it never happened. And finally, the Bastille column went up in 1847. Whether they all survived and still work, which many do not, the 15 fountains dispensing water for the Parisian public set a new precedent in terms of ironically democratizing the supply of water in the city, contributing to the view that it was an essential public and civic need. New fountains were added later under Haussmann, of course, the fontaine, that you see at the Place Saint-Michel, for example. And then there's the fascinating story of the Wallace fountains, which is something that I adore in Paris, which is the gift of public drinking fountains to the people of Paris. I don't have time to go into this, but I'll just mention it, by Sir Richard Wallace, an English philanthropist who was moved by the suffering of the Parisians during the Franco-Prussian War in 1870-71, and he gifted 50 of them in 1872, and then added to them, and there are now 106 of them that are fully operating in Paris, and you can still use them, and they're clean, and so forth. It was the Ourcq Canal project, however, which Chapsal had discussed with Napoleon, that provided the city with a significant new source of water and new ideas about how water could be supplied to a city like Paris. It was inaugurated with a decree on the 19th of May, 1802. 1802 seems to be a landmark year in terms of the hydrological history of Paris. And Napoleon chose a 37-year-old engineer, Pierre-Simon Girard, who accompanied him on his expedition to Egypt to oversee it. It was officially finished in 1825, of course, after Napoleon's death. Napoleon's initiatives laid the groundwork for the hydrological work to which historians have devoted far, far greater amount of attention of George Haussmann and Eugène Belgrand in the 1850s and 1860s. By the second half of the 19th century, the needs of the capital were perceived to be immense, and water was viewed as absolutely indispensable as the population of the city grew. It was Haussmann who put in place the elaborate system of water distribution through pipes to private homes, apartments, and public buildings, which the French still rely on today, which came from diverse sources, springs and water diverted from rivers like the Ourcq, into canals, including we have the Canal Saint-Martin, the Canal Saint-Denis, which became integral parts of the city's waterscape. Sanitation and the democratization of the water supply were at the heart of what one might call a kind of hydrological revolution of the early 19th century, or of the 19th century more generally, that was first initiated by Napoleon and expanded on immeasurably by Haussmann and Belgrand. After 1880, the water carrier more or less disappeared from the waterscape and landscape of Paris, though one can still find postcards depicting some of them as late as the 1920s. And there's actually a caption saying le dernier porteur d'eau from 1921 from Montmartre. Part of the sanitation drive that shaped this hydrological revolution, creating new needs for water, was also manifested in the expansion and in development of bathing establishments along the entire length of the Seine, a subject that environmental historians have neglected. And yet they were at their high point and in their heyday. The first floating bathing establishment designed for hot baths was not introduced until 1761, when its owner, Poitevin, came up with the idea of using a boat with steam engines to heat water for bathtubs that would be placed in private bathing cabins. He built 2 boats that were 47 meters long on 2 levels, which were docked at the Pont Royal bridge. In 1762, there were 9 bathing boats with greater or fewer amenities and luxuries. The Poitevin baths even found their way into the 7th volume of Diderot and d'Alembert's Encyclopédie. And this is a drawing, and they talk about this. In 1791, Pierre Vigier, a lawyer in the Parliament of Paris, purchased Poitevin's bathing boats and launched himself into a new career, which made him into one of the richest men in the city by the time of his death in 1817. Pierre-Simon Girard wrote a report on the city's baths and noted that they were of different kinds, ranging from hot to cold, those at no cost for the poor and the sick, Turkish baths, Russian steam baths, and even 2 Jewish baths, all serving a varied social clientele. For Girard, the proliferation of bathing establishments was a reflection of growing economic affluence and an attachment to comfort to which, quote, all classes of society have become accustomed. The Bain Vigier consisted of 4 establishments that were extremely popular among the Parisian bourgeoisie in the 19th century. And there are a lot of depictions of them. These are 2, one photographic from 1905 and the other from 1860. The largest floating bathhouse was moored on the right bank with 118 baths. The second had 108. The third largest served the Ile Saint-Louis and its surrounding neighborhoods with 54. Their increase was linked to the ability to procure water economically. The water that was used came from the Seine, but after 1817, it came from the fountains, and then in the late 1820s from the newly constructed Ourcq Canal. For those who would or could not frequent public floating bathing establishments, entrepreneurs offered baignoires mobiles or thermophores, portable bathtubs, to customers who wished to bathe at home. Of the 78 public baths on the river that existed in Paris in 1832, 58 had this service to transport bathtubs elsewhere. We have a rare aerial photographic view of the crowded bathscape of the Seine, captured by one of the most talented photographers of the Second Empire, Baldus, who was actually employed by the French state, who's actually German, but was a naturalized French citizen. And there you can see the bathtubs, the bath boats along the river. In addition to the river's hot baths, there were the 3 swimming schools on the Seine and pools. Perhaps the most famous was the Deligny pool, or the floating Bain Deligny. They were reflected in numerous pictorial representations throughout the 19th century. The painter Bassompierre depicted its opulence in its heyday. In 1842 here, you can see kind of semi-Moorish architecture and so on. They kind of changed a bit later on. By 1858, we have Honoré Daumier presenting a kind of caricatural image of the pool there. Finally, inhabitants had long used the water of the Seine and its tributaries to wash their clothes and other textiles, but it was only in the 19th century that wooden boats, the bateaux lavois, began to proliferate and serve as wash houses for those with the financial means to provide their laundry. By 1858, 64 bateaux lavois were moored between the Pont Marie and the Pont des Invalides, while 91 were located on dry land. They too were immortalized, but this time not in caricature, but in sympathetic portrayals by the working poor. Honoré Daumier, here of the laundress at the Quai d'Anjou, climbing up with her young child, or in drawings by other artists as well, showing the interiors of these boats along the river. And many of them survived actually into the 1940s. One cannot talk about the hydrological revolution, if you will, of the 19th century, which I've been mainly discussing in the context of the Seine and various engineering initiatives, and reflecting new ways in which the city-state and the general public considered water, without talking about Paris's other river, the Bièvre, on the left bank. It became the city's hydrological environmental casualty, as I said at the beginning. It is no longer visible or part of the city's waterscape above ground. It was transformed into an underground sewer at the beginning of the 20th century and is now culverted, meaning covered and channeled. However, certain streets in Paris still bear witness to its past existence, including the Rue de Bièvre and the Rue de la Glacière, which was a section of the city where the ponds it fed froze over in the winter and became skating rinks, and pieces of its ice were stored in deep wells for the summer months. Until the 17th century, the Bièvre was more a suburban river and served as a source of drinking water for religious establishments. In fact, the quality of the water was much better than the Seine. It supplied water for market gardens and eventually for mills and laundries. Then a man by the name of Gobelin, from whom the area today of the Gobelins derives its name, moved his textile dyeing business there, and in 1662, Colbert, Louis XIV's finance minister, bought the land and the workshops of the Gobelins to found a royal manufactory for tapestries and furniture. And this marked the beginnings of the transformation of the Bièvre into an industrial cesspool. While Madame de Maintenon, the mistress of Louis XIV, once declared that the shrimps that came out of the Bièvre were, quote, the best that can be imagined. By the second half of the 18th century, it was so polluted that fish had largely disappeared from it. The banks of the river were mournful places, known for their noxious odors. And these are two sort of representations of what the Bièvre looked like by the 19th century. Atget, of course, one of the great photographers of Paris during this period, and this is a kind of a depiction of it in pictorial form. So we have the Bièvre, which has a very different kind of history. Of course, it was a smaller river, but nonetheless, it was one of the rivers of Paris. And it's here that we see the perceived, conceived, and lived space, to use Henri Lefebvre's categories, coming together. Unlike the Seine, the Bièvre did not inspire romantic literary musings. The novelist Joris Karl Huysmans bore witness to the river's terrible fate in a prose poem which he published at the very end of the 19th century, in which he said, quote, "The Bièvre today represents the perfect symbol of feminine misery exploited by the big city," unquote. He compared the Bièvre to a young girl who had hardly reached puberty, and like many young country girls who come to the city, come only to be ambushed by, quote, "industrial press gangs," unquote, and put to work and exhausted by the horrible tasks required of her. In other words, a river prostituted. In short, the Bièvre was transformed into an open-air sewer, but then a closed sewer, by the end of the 19th century. During the Third Republic, the city took the final step to eradicate it, in essence, by covering it over completely between 1884 and 1912, and incorporating it into the city's sewer system, after which it disappeared from the city's waterscape, although there are currently efforts to revive it in certain kinds of places. So by way of conclusion, what I have been tracing here is the changing uses and perceptions of water in the city of Paris's transition from an early modern to a modern city, and particularly the importance of this hydrological revolution of the 19th century, which historians traditionally date from the period of Haussmannization, but which I see as much earlier, and which was bound to prior drives for sanitation and to the perception that water was a fundamental need, leading to a process of democratization in terms of its distribution and use, even if you have a social segregation in its use, as you can certainly see in the case of the baths. And what I mean by democratization in this sense is the perception that all have a need for water, even if there's no consensus about what is meant to need water and what a water need is or was, and how water needs are determined, measured, or met. And these still they were, and they still are, very complicated questions, in fact, speaking as a resident of Southern California for much of the year. In this period, you have the development of extended and complicated discussions about need, necessity, scarcity, and then the beginnings, the creeping in of the word rights, which is very, very interesting. And I don't want to be anachronistic and sort of talk, oh, well, you know, this is the origins of environmental justice, but there is the kind of a seed there that you can see. What I have tried to indicate today is the way in which the city of Paris's waterscape was physically transformed with the disappearance of household or neighborhood wells, water carriers, bath keepers, and floating laundries and the laundresses associated with them. In other words, the disappearance of also the whole social underpinning of the city's water system. And this subject is of enormous importance, I think, and is something that has really been very neglected, these social underpinnings. The pumps of the Seine are now long gone, as are the bathhouses and the Bateau Lavoir. The view across the Seine from the right to the left bank is now unobstructed, and increasingly the Seine and the city's waterscape that is visible above ground has become space of leisure, recreation, aesthetic consumption. Nowhere is this more clearly observable than on the islands of the Seine. And in the history of a new man-made island, the Île aux Cygnes, there was once an Île des Cygnes going back to the 16th century that was fused to the left bank. But this is the Île aux Cygnes, not the Île des Cygnes, that was artificially created between 1825 and 1827. It is the smallest of the city's present-day islands. In 1830, trees were planted on it, and it became the site on which a replica of Auguste Bartholdi's Statue of Liberty was erected during the International Exhibition of 1889. And from that year onwards, it periodically showcased a series of events and international exhibitions. including the Summer Olympics of 1900 and the 1937 Universal Exposition. Another such aquatic island space is the Ile de la Grande Jatte, which is at the very limits of Paris. It's not actually within Paris, and immortalized in an 1884-1886 painting by the neo-impressionist painting Georges Seurat, Sunday afternoon on the island of the Grande Jatte, which depicts a broad cross-section of the population of Paris, a worker with his pipe, a bourgeois with his cigar, a young girl with flowers, a courtesan walking with a marmoset monkey, families, and single women without chaperone enjoying a Sunday afternoon in one of the green waterscapes of Paris. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for that fascinating tour of the landscape and the waterscape of Paris. I guess I will start the Q&A by posing a question and then open it up to the audience. I'm interested in whether there were tensions between these various uses. Like, you can imagine that using it for drinking water versus washing your clothes in it, that there might be some kind of tension there between the various people trying to use them for different purposes, or whether there is a sense that bathing in it or doing laundry in it is somehow sullying it or not. Maybe that's a very 21st century view. I don't know. But I'm just curious if you came across that at all.
Yes, there was, and essentially the kind of regulations and rules largely developed out of those kinds of conflicts. And there was the whole question of, who was to determine this. And there was often sort of a fight, depending if you're talking before or after the revolution, the degree to which, the city would be involved in this, or the monarchy. And yes, definitely. And you can certainly see that. I spoke very briefly about the Bièvre, but you can particularly see it there, because actually what's so tragic about the Bièvre is that the water, those of you who've lived in Paris know that the water is very hard water. The Bièvre was soft water. It was excellent on a number of different levels, drinking water. That's in fact why the textile manufacturers went there, because the water was not as harsh and they could do their processes more easily and wouldn't damage their materials. So you did have a lot of those conflicts occurring, particularly from the 18th century onwards. But most of my work has really been from the 18th century. I have mentioned the 17th and 16th century, but I haven't really done sort of on the ground, in the weeds research regarding that. But yes, because water, as we know, is used for all kinds of different purposes. And then where do you put it? In fact, I should have pointed this out, the water carriers, you saw that they have these two kind of buckets, or whatever you call them, receptacles that they have. And one of them was for drinking water, and the other one was not.
Washing.
Yeah. So you had to be very clear that you had to separate the two. And then there was this whole battle over the Ourcq Canal, for example, because the chief engineer, this young guy in his 30s, insisted that this had to be drinking water and that nothing else should happen with it. And then there were those who wanted also to use it for navigation. And in the end, there was this very bad compromise because it kept getting contaminated. It was used for both purposes, but yes. And there's a whole, when you talk about environmental legislation in France, there's a whole patchwork of it that was constantly violated, by the way. Yeah.
Okay, I see Jinu Che to start, and then we'll go from there.
Thank you so much for this talk. I really found striking the language of the May 1806 decree. The city's fountains be available to everybody to refresh the atmosphere. And I know you have a chapter on air, but I just wanted to know how this kind of comes together with the water. So as Paris and its surroundings, both upstream and downstream, industrialize, how do sort of conceptions of and as sort of like the hydrological cycle becomes a more popular sort of understanding in the 19th and 20th centuries? How does that sort of, how do people understand the nature of the relations between water and air? Is there sort of anxiety about dirty rain? Because the nexus of the two is precipitation, of course, which replenishes the wells. So I'm just curious about where those two meet in public discourse.
Yeah, well, there was a lot more discussion and concern about air than there was about water, in fact. And there, from what at least I've seen, there was little attempt to link the two, which is strange, and it would seem to be obvious, of course. But in essence, some of the first legislation that actually stuck in the end had to do with air, not with water. And I've done some other work. I've done a sort of an article on different kinds of pollution, and I've done an article on noise pollution and the idea of noise as pollution. And actually, that kind of pollution was the last to be identified. So these different concerns were more compartmentalized from what I have seen than I would have expected, is, sort of my general comment on that.
Okay, next to Jinu. I'm sorry, I don't.
Spence Wainwright, GFL. Thank you so much for this, Caroline. I wanted to follow the river, as it were. At the very end, you take us just outside the limits of Paris to Grandjatte. And I was curious about how you're thinking about the limits of Paris, because obviously the environmental angle then forces you in some ways to spill over.
Yeah.
And thinking about, one, how the cities and towns and regions downstream from Paris that are getting all of the outflow figure into this history, but also given the kind of dominance of Paris within French policy, history, culture, and so on, to what extent, how would the environmental histories of the other major cities even, to say nothing of the small towns, not only how are they different, but like, do the projects in the Southwest, for example, really feel we're getting short shrift because all the attention is on Paris?
Mm. Yeah, I don't, to be honest, I don't have an answer to that question, but, to other regions of France. But I do have a kind of tentative answer with regard to the areas immediately outside of Paris. If you notice, I said at the very beginning that the city of Paris had considerable control over what it could do with the water outside of the city, bringing things in and accessing it and getting things and so on. That changed with the French Revolution. And a lot of the towns and localities outside of the city of Paris really began to push back. Because there are a lot of, the Ourcq, for example, I mean, that was a struggle to deal with the Ourcq Canal. So what I would say is that actually from the revolution onwards, the city of Paris and what could be done, I mean, was sort of reined in, and that is something that surprised me in my work, that the degree to which you have these localities resisting Paris and even the French state, because, I mean, the city obviously could do so much, but the state can do a lot more, right? So as far as thinking about, I don't know, a city elsewhere in France, Lyon or something like that, and what the relationship or how they would be regarding this, I don't know, but it's a very interesting question. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I have a rather long list. Liz, were you just?
I was
Ms.
thinking.
Foster.
Thank you so much. I wanted to ask about your sources, I mean, some of which you've showed us. But I'm trying to imagine myself as a researcher, like, I want to write a history of water over, a couple hundred years. I mean, some of the things feel somewhat obvious, look for the engineers, et cetera, but you're also clearly drawing on, social history, Mercier. I'm curious to hear more about how you identified your source base for this, because it's not obvious what it would be.
Well, my response to that is that you're doing this kind of environmental history, and environmental historians in general are magpies. They have to look far more broadly than historians perhaps doing other kinds of things because of the nature of the work. And for me, I don't make a separation between social history and environmental history, which is in fact why I bring up Lefebvre. And I in fact find, I probably will be very criticized, this is being taped, that this environmental historians sometimes also themselves compartmentalize themselves too much, between the sort of physical, material environmental historians who are based on science and findings of science, and then the cultural historians of the environment that are, working on other kinds of sources. And for me, I don't like being in one or the other. I precisely like to look at a lot of different sources, and especially as, I didn't start out as an environmental historian, but especially as a historian where the 19th century is very near and dear to me. Literature, painting, I don't use music, but I look at a big variety of sources, archival resources, literary sources. All of these can speak to you when you're asking these questions, particularly if you're looking at the social underpinning of things like water systems that develop over time. But, I have certain series of the National Archives that I use, particularly the Pont et Chaussée, and others.
Okay, so just so people know the order here, we have Muriel, Victor, Eric Chapman, Daisy, Joyce, did I see your hand? And Daniel. So, Muriel.
Thank you so much. First to tell us that the French were actually trying to wash and not those dirty people. That's really interesting, comforting. I'm French. I would like also to thank you very much because your presentation resonates with me on two counts. This elephant that you mentioned, I didn't know about that, but I live in Nantes. I'm not a historian, I'm a political scientist, and I teach in the University of Nantes. And in Nantes, there's a big elephant throwing water on the people. So hearing you, I'm pretty sure, that's my little historic puzzle, I'm sure that the artistic company that built this elephant had knowledge of this. I'm pretty sure. I don't know if you know about that. Second reason why
I don't know about that.
Oh, you must visit it.
I'll
It's
find
wild.
out. Second thing is that I'm very moved by your story of La Bièvre because my dad lives on La Bièvre and it's buried. I knew it was there. I was always concerned that it might overflow or so. And so I think by now I will try to find the book by Huysmans, La Bièvre, and I think it would be the best present for him. And lastly, I have a question for you.
And by the way, Victor Hugo spent a lot of time also at the Bièvre, and he's written, I left that out of my talk.
Thank you so much. This is really cool. My question now for you as a historian is how come with all this engineering, and it's very striking that it's a really labored and very competent set of people who worked on this waterscape, how come is Paris water still so polluted? And you know that it's a topic for the Olympic Games. It was planned that we could swim in the Seine. Jacques Chirac, when he was the mayor of Paris, wanted to swim in the Seine. It never happened. So what is your take as an environmental historian on that environmental problem?
I can't really speak to present-day concern.
see a causality, a historic causality to this?
The whole thing about swimming in the Seine, it's a kind of French 20th century obsession, I would say.
Yeah, but I mean, other cities such as Copenhagen can actually swim in their city rivers. It's a common obsession now that we should all live in cleaner cities.
I don't think that would be the case with the Thames, but yeah.
Ha.
Yeah. I mean, actually, the water is not bad in Paris. I mean, actually, as I've said, I mean, the original quality of the water, the Seine and some of its sources are very hard. That is part of the problem, in fact.
It goes through the human body and
Yeah.
one finds the time. Like that.
But for the current day, I don't really have an answer to that.
All right, Victor's next.
Hi, Victor Ciao. I teach in the History of Science department here. Thank you for your talk. I was just reading your article that you mentioned earlier on the sound of Paris and on noise pollution, and it sort of also made me think about sort of, in relation to this, sort of the sounds of water, and I was wondering whether you had something to say on that front, one. And then second, also related to that article, I thought something that was quite interesting was how you had sort of identified this shift from the 18th century, the early 19th century transformation of interactions with these sounds as sort of disturbances to the sort of public health discourse that emerges at that time. And I was wondering whether there's something sort of parallel that's developing here in regard to water too.
Yes, that's something which actually I left out of the talk because you have all the kinds of appraisals. There is a sort of an agronomist, pharmacist, Parmentier, who was one of the great defenders of the water of the Seine and wrote this kind of tract defending the Seine in 1787. And a lot of the way water was appraised in even the late 18th century was by smelling it, by the color of it, and so on. And then in the late 18th century even, you have really the beginnings of science. I mean, you have Lavoisier, you have Cavendish, and so on. So you really begin to have the scientific study of water. And at that point, that does come into play, certainly by the time of Haussmann, not in the early 19th century with Napoleon and various things that he's doing. So science begins to play a major role, but it's slow in coming in terms of actually having an impact on how water is evaluated and also distributed within the city. But you do have a similar kind of medicalized discourse surrounding water, just as you do with noise. And certainly by the late 19th century, it's there. Absolutely. Mm-hmm.
Okay, Eric Chapman is next.
This is a wonderful project. I have a couple of related questions. One is the extent to which the project, both the air and this is implied in the earlier question, gets you involved in some of the particularities of Paris's relationship to industry and the locations of industry and the regulation of industry. And my rough impression is that industry is permitted much more downstream and upstream in Paris than in the city itself. So I'm curious about that. And then the second question is really about policing and whether there's a history of police on the river and how what challenges the Paris police world have in protecting, regulating, permitting people to use it or not use it. Do they start using boats? I mean, this is the place of this story in the history of the police.
Okay, yeah, great questions. Yeah, in terms of industry downstream, you're absolutely right, and there's good reason for that. In terms of industries also, there is a kind of whole history of industries that are moved out of certain kinds of areas. And again, the Bièvre is an interesting case in question because what happens gradually, roughly from the 17th century to the 19th century, is some of the industries that you might have operating on the Seine using water and so forth are basically transferred to the Bièvre. They're told you can't work here anymore because, you know, the Seine, there are all kinds of regulations associated with this. We have to preserve the Seine at all costs, and therefore find your place elsewhere. And so I have, you know, evidence of a number, particularly in textiles, of things that are being moved around the cities because certain parts of the waterscape are not exactly protected, but are considered to be more important than other waterscapes. They're not considered in the same way, and for different reasons. So, and by and large, there is a move to move industry out of the city, as you probably know, in general. What I do find very interesting is that at certain points there's talk of moving car factories to islands. And this is just to get them off shore kind of thing. But you have the same problem if they're in the middle of the river on the island. So that's a kind of bizarre case in point. In terms of policing, I don't have a lot of material on policing, actually, in terms of, I have more on, you know, for example, the noise pollution. These are things that go directly to the local police. But, you know, when you're talking about waterways, it's a very different terrain that you're dealing with there. And in some cases, you would need boats or you'd need ways to get across the terrain or the landscape or the waterscape. So I don't have a lot of evidence on that. Interesting. Be interesting to know.
Yeah, it's surprising. I would think that there would be police boats, just like there are fire boats and, you know,
Yeah.
whatnot. And,
I have not come across any police boats.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
But were there fire boats? No.
Not
Interesting. Maybe that's an American thing. Okay. All right. I have Daisy, Joyce, Daniel, and Art. So Daisy.
For this fascinating talk. As you're speaking about the democratization of water, I also thought of nostalgia in this morning of a lost Paris. I guess I was thinking of both Baudelaire, who goes looking for water and he finds no water, and so he has to bathe himself in the dust. But he prays to the god for rain, not for a fountain. And I was also thinking of this collection that begins by preserving the songs of the porteurs d'eau. So there's this morning, and I guess I wonder how you reconcile or think about, on the one hand, this democratization and this new ability to have water, and on the other hand, this mourning and this consciousness of losing something, and in part losing these workers, these porteurs d'eau.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's very interesting. As I was thinking about this material, I mean, you know, you have technological advances of all kinds. We have them today that lead to, and that can improve things, make things better, make things cleaner, but that lead to real hardship in terms of livelihoods and certain kinds of ways of life. And it's a compelling question. Should we have kept the porteurs d'eau? Doesn't make sense really, but you know, if you think of 25 to 30,000 families
Right.
relying on this particular occupation, they move to something else. I don't exactly know what they moved to, but yes, I mean, they're also, in some ways, human casualties as well to sort of technological change, advancement, also cleaning up the environment as well, as we well know. Yeah,
And I
but it's
might
interesting.
just piggyback on that to say that, you know, it also moved from a mediated access to your water to, like, if you're getting it from a tap, it's just there, and you're not interacting with a person to get it. And so that's it's maybe a gain of time, but a loss of something else, right? In terms of, I don't know, a human connection or what have you. I think about that now in terms of, you know, You can buy your stamps online. You don't even have to deal with a postal worker if you don't want to. And just as an example of like an unmediated, something that used to require a kind of human interaction that doesn't anymore. But getting a little off topic there. Okay, was that, yeah?
Oh, yes.
Did you have a second question? No? Okay, wonderful. Joyce Chaplin.
I'm going to kind of come back to the policing question, but put it in terms of law and crime. Because there must be a legal record that indicates all kinds of things, like smuggling. With the bathhouses, I wondered about prostitution,
there's a lot of
murder, suicide, you name it. So, and I'm not asking only kind of for the lurid details, but in terms of law regulating water and access to it, and you had it, I think the longer history as you move toward adjudication of rights to it could be informative. So I'm kind of wondering about the crime. Also security at moments when Paris isn't under kind of stable political control. How are those kind of backgrounds for the shift that you see later?
Yeah, and one has to bear in mind also that Paris during this period, the 19th century, well, you have the revolution, of course, and then you have the 19th century as a period of revolution and upheaval of all kinds. And so, certain things are constantly being interrupted in one way or another. But the legal aspect is very important. And again, you do have also certain statutes for certain sorts of professions. I mean, the people keeping baths, actually, that is a trade that goes back to the 13th century or so on, but this is long before the floating baths and that sort of thing. But I haven't really gone so much into the legal, kind of, except impressionistically, because it is a huge subject, but it is an important one to get an insight, in particular, into the areas of contestation and the way they developed. And it's out of contestation that frequently you have regulations and you have laws that are developed to regulate things. I have come across incidents concerning bathhouses and prostitution in particular. And it isn't the high-end bourgeois bain vigier, but the other kind of variety. There are huge numbers. Yeah. And so it's an interesting question. I just don't have a lot of work that I've done specifically on that.
Okay, Daniel Ziblin.
Yeah, so very much following up on the last question. I mean, in terms of the contamination and Herrick's question about regulation of water, I mean, one of the most important Supreme Court cases in the U.S. is Slaughterhouse case in the 1870s in the U.S., which was about moving the butchers down, creating a monopoly, moving them downstream from the city. And so you had said that used the passive voice, that businesses were moved. And so I'm wondering, could one tell a legal story, or have you looked into that, or is that environmental history more broadly understood in the spirit of your earlier comment?
Yeah.
Were there legal battles over moving of industry outside of cities or downstream?
Well, there was, it was in the Napoleonic period, there was a whole, kind of series of decrees and laws regarding industrial enterprises. In fact, people see the beginning of industrial regulation in that particular period. And so it was the state, it wasn't the municipality that actually came out with sort of rules, regulations, and codes regarding this. And most of those kind of rules and regulations apply to industrial enterprises having to do with textile production. So that's what I've mostly come across. I have not so much come across things having to do with slaughterhouses. And generally, a lot of those were not actually within the central part of the city themselves, at least in Paris. I mean, I don't know how it worked out in American cities, so I'm not quite sure This is in Louisiana, yeah. I think that they were actually moved out long before my period in time, yeah.
Okay, Art Goldhammer.
Thanks for a fascinating talk. I have two questions. The first has to do with your comment about the application of science to the water issue and the medicalization of the discourse. Could you link that to specific events? I have in mind, for example, the cholera epidemic of 1832. I know that there was an effort to organize surveys of the outbreak of disease around specific fountains. I think it was Dr. Bichat was involved in that. Were there other similar events of that kind that led to the medicalization discourse? The second question has to do with the connection between the system of water distribution and the system for cleaning the streets, which it seems to me in Paris, they're more intimately connected than in other cities that I know of. Have you thought about that?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. Belgrand talks a lot about that, and about his concerns about the fact that he felt, as sort of the chief water engineer, that the systems were not as separated as they should be, and there was a huge argument that he actually had with Haussmann about this. And what it came down to, which may not surprise you, is cost. And Haussmann argued that, he would spend money on some things, but not on others. That we can do this. We can separate it also in some parts of the city to a greater extent, and you can imagine what areas of the city that would be, the wealthier areas of the city, whereas not in others. So that is another. I have talked about the democratization of the water supply, but in writing my texts, I do sort of talk about also the social differentiation and segregation that goes on at the same time. And I don't think that they're mutually exclusive, but that's going down another tract. But you're right that in Paris, especially during Haussmann, there was less of, well, in actuality, when the system went in place, a separation between sort of cleaning and drinking, the two sorts of supply. And that developed into problems later at the beginning of the 20th century, getting back to the question of water quality. As far as specific events, yes, there were various times. In fact, what I found most surprising is that various studies were undertaken, for example, of the Bièvre, right in the middle of the French Revolution in 1791. That is not exactly a period in time when you would think they would be doing studies of the Bièvre to see and about disease in the Bièvre. The cholera epidemic, there were a lot of studies that were generated as a result of that. Again, after the Franco-Prussian War is another time. A lot of this had to do, yes, with disease, but it had also to do with casts of characters. Certain people get into positions within the government who have a particular interest in these things. So yes, they are linked. And the 19th century, I mean, even though you have this big sanitation drive going on, and well, you've translated Alain Colbert, Alain Colbert's whole discussion of hygiene and Allais and all of that. And yes, it's an incredible century of disease of all kinds. I mean, there's cholera, there's TB, all kinds of different things. But yes, I mean, the Service des Eaux, which really gets off the ground again under Napoleon, gradually over a period of time professionalizes, and I think you can see far more of an introduction of, scientific expertise and a recognition that you need scientific expertise, in fact. Yeah.
I'm wondering how far up are you planning on taking this chronologically? Because one sort of wonders, if you went all the way to, say, post-World War II, you'd have a story of, more people having, I don't know, hot water in their homes, in their apartments, and just a kind of different kind of set of social expectations that, even Victoria de Grazia writes about a long time ago in her book about, Americanization and so forth, and the sort of standards of living and so forth. Are you going all the way up to that and thinking about indoor plumbing and all that kind of stuff, or are you mostly interested in this kind of more public worksy period in the 19th century?
Yeah, I'm not going up that far. I have too much on my plate as I have right here, especially given the sort of wide range of, subjects that I'm dealing with here. And in fact, they're wonderful environmental historians of Paris, and but the work has tended to be sort of compartmentalized into different areas. I mean, people studying air pollution, people studying water, people studying different sort of aspects of the environment. And what I'm trying to do here, I hope I will be successful, is to bring that together into this interconnected whole. And that is a real challenge in and of itself. And I also want to talk about this sort of moment of real, transformation of change on all kinds of different levels. The work on sound, the work on water, the work on air, all of these kinds of things. And I have this whole chapter on the earth and the creation of the transportation system and what that does in the 19th century. So given all of the aspects of this that I want to deal with, I'm really not taking it very far into the 20th century.
Right.
Right.
Oh, that makes sense. Thank you. Lena?
I just had a question on a lot of the things that you showed us were kind of big infrastructure projects and a lot of engineering, and in connection to the state also being a big, which is a very French thing, right? Like it's very much, the French state is very good at mobilizing resources for these big infrastructure projects. And I was wondering, like, can we, from like the Seine, is there like something very distinguished about, like something very specific about this kind of French involvement in like modernizing territory, constructing territory, that comes out of this like relationship between Paris and the Seine, and the centrality of the Seine is like something that's very central in Paris, like the main kind of line dividing the city. And with regards to that, I was thinking about during the French Revolution, there's this anecdote of like the first test of like the steamboats. Like there's a steamboat going back and forth on the Seine in the middle of the French Revolution. It's completely random. Some American or British is there, and he's doing these like back and forths on the Seine, and people are just noticing this. And I was interested with this relationship with a very specific idea of modernity that is very French, that is based on infrastructure and engineering, and the connection to the state that comes out from this history of like Paris and the Seine, if that makes any sense. Is that kind of a question? Is that something that you see coming out of the very long history of the Seine that you were doing?
Well, yeah. I mean, you do have and also you have this institution in France, which is established before the Revolution, which becomes extremely, important in the late 18th century and into the 19th century, which is the Pont et Chaussée. And the Pont et Chaussée, bridges and roads, I mean, it sounds like sort of a mundane sort of institution, but it is not. I mean, it is this technological powerhouse of the best engineers, many of them trained at the École Polytechnique, and many of the ideas for a lot of these projects, really come out of that. And there is a lot of work that has been done by historians of science in France on this particular institution. And so I think one has to look at this also in terms of the development of the French state and the institutions of the French state. And we all know that the French state is a very centralized state. It goes back a long way. and as you say, it undertakes these big projects, and this is, of course, the capital city of Paris. Before the revolution, even after the revolution, the seat of the monarchy, but, you know, different ones come and go. Yeah, but also what's interesting is the survival, or not the survival, but the persistence of these very important state institutions that put their stamp and shape all of this. So when I talk about the Napoleonic period, I'm talking about the period, it's not just Napoleon decides to do fountains. I mean, you've got this whole slew of engineers and architects associated with that. Yeah.
You just said that they shape it, and the title of your talk was The Shape of Water. I wonder if there's something about, I mean, I found that an intriguing title, given that water sort of moves and doesn't really have a shape. Is there something about that word that spoke to you about sort of organizing your thinking in terms of how to do a history of hydraulics?
Well, I'm really thinking of it as a broader topic of shaping and reshaping. And I find also really interesting in thinking about the Seine is also the islands. I mean,
Yeah.
you know, this is sort of, you know, almost like a metaphor of what I'm talking about, the shape of water. They come and they go, and the state decides to fuse it to the right bank or to the left bank, and then they disappear by themselves, you know, at certain moments in time. And so I'm very interested in the dynamic of, you know, what is done through man-made initiatives, and
Yeah.
then also what are some of the natural processes that occur at the same time. Do you see what I mean?
Yes, excellent. Do we have any other questions for Professor Ford? If not, I will thank you warmly for a very interesting talk.